Hi, everyone. Welcome to our March CXCOP. I'm Candace Thorson. I have Mallory Bateman, our speaker, and so we'll just give everybody a few minutes to join. Today, we're going to talk about how you can use data to understand and engage with your constituents. So, if you want to, in the meantime, if you want to put in the chat like where you're from, I always enjoy doing that because I'm in New York, from like upstate-ish New York, and I always love hearing about like where other people are because so many of you are really great places. So if you just want to put in where you're coming from, that would be great. Um, Mallory, do you just want to say where you're from? Oh, join DC. Cool.
I'm joining
Orlando.
from Salt Lake City.
Yes. It's very cool. I've never been there. It's on my list. It really is. But Laguna Beach, Salem, Oregon. Oh, that's really cool. I've meant to go to Oregon. I just haven't made it there.
Oh,
Herndon,
Oregon's really
Virginia,
beautiful.
Seattle. Yeah, Seattle is very nice. Georgia. Very cool. Very cool. Where in Georgia? Kentucky. I've never made it to Kentucky. It's on my list. Northfield, Fulton County. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. California. Fort Washington. Johannesburg. Very cool.
Mhm.
San Jose, Brooklyn. See, it's very neat. Somebody joined from Hawaii once. I thought that was really,
Oh, nice.
yeah, I want to go to Hawaii. I don't think I've ever made it there. Washington State. We'll just let people join a little bit. We do have a poll question that I just want to pull up for a moment. Excellent. So while you're joining, if you want to just answer, our question is, do you feel that you can adequately explain the value of CX to your colleagues or to your bosses? So, yes, you feel you can adequately do that, no, or you're not really sure. So we just want to take that while we're just giving everybody a minute or so. And I'm a bit technically challenged and apparently can't figure out how to pull up poll questions myself. Otherwise, I would have done this earlier. Um, but yeah, we'll just give you a minute or so to be able to answer that. But our topic today is to talk about how you can use data to understand and engage with your constituents. So we have with us, because the idea is that agencies at all levels have a lot of data, and sometimes it's really nice and neatly organized in Excel spreadsheets, and sometimes it's like in PDFs or things like audio files, video, whatever. And so the challenge is how agencies can figure out how to use data to understand their audiences and to be able to reach them in the most effective way and to help craft public policy that helps them the most. So what we're going to do is we have with us Mallory Bateman, who is Director of Demographic Research at the Currency Gardner Policy Institute in Salt Lake City. And previously, she was a senior research analyst and state data center coordinator there. Before she joined the Policy Institute, it is the end of the day. I do apologize. I do know how to say your name. Mallory was a research analyst at the Utah Foundation, and she looked at issues when she was there, like urban planning and transportation and civic engagement. She also spent time in the nonprofit and the industry sectors. She has her BA in urban planning from the University of Utah, and she graduated from the London School of Economics with an MSc in social policy and planning, which I'm sure was a very interesting experience. So just a few housekeeping items to go over. Like I said, we have the open chat where you can not only put your location, but you can put in your ideas and anything else. We have a LinkedIn group that you can feel free to join later on as well. But it's Mallory. So our question today, our first question is, if you could sort of lay the groundwork, like how can data help agencies engage with constituents and promote better public policy? So how, just starting off, why is that important?
Yeah, so I mean, the main thing is it can help you identify your audience, right? Like getting some insights into who you're trying to reach or connect with. There are a lot of free and public data sources that you can use to get some kind of big ideas as to who they are. And so then that'll help you craft any kind of engagement strategy a little bit better than just kind of going into the void. And then, I think in the kind of promoting better public policy sense, um, in theory, you would look at, who that audience is and kind of look at different variables and aspects to see, where there are gaps and identify, places where there might be room for improvement. And you could direct your public policy efforts in those spaces. Also provides you a nice way to track changes over time. Sometimes it's not readily apparent, sometimes just due to different restrictions around data. You need to wait a while before you're going to see a change, or it'll take a long time for that change to show up in the data. But I know at the Gardner Institute, we get a lot of requests for, okay, we need a variable we can track year over year to see what this change is. And we try to help those stakeholders refine to something where you might actually see a change rather than, something that needs a generational nudge. But broadly speaking, I think those are kind of the things, helping know who your audience is. Data gives you that insight.
Yeah, and it's true. You'd be very anxious to see how a project or something like that has evolved, like what the measurement is. But sometimes you're right; it does take a lot of time. So, um, why do agencies or governments in general, why do they really struggle with how to use data in this way to make the most of it?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I'm coming from a state where there's some certain attitudes around data. And so sometimes you have challenges of pre-existing narratives. Someone had a data point that had a really good soundbite with it 15 years ago, and no one has investigated it since. And so I think that is something that provides a nice opportunity to shed light with new data.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, gotta try to keep something a little bit positive. So maybe taking that angle, I think sometimes data can be just messy. It can be hard to navigate. When you do have, with an example like the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau, for smaller communities, you get these 5-year population estimate windows. And those can be hard to describe to people. It can be hard to understand what the change is. If you have, most of the data sets we've gotten so far have COVID smack in the middle, so maybe it's really
Yeah.
tricky to parse out details. But I think, the general attitudes, I think right now are some of the big hurdles, and then having people that understand the nuances. Isn't necessarily a struggle, but I think finding the right people to help you navigate the data is really a critical piece that maybe doesn't get a ton of focus necessarily.
Yeah, you made a good point about COVID, actually, because for all different things, like you can look at, going back 5 years or whatever, and look at no matter what it is, whether it's crime or health, or it doesn't make a difference. And that time period does show in a lot of cases a very dramatic difference that really can sort of change the trajectory. But there is a story there that explains why that happened that isn't necessarily true anymore. So is that something you have to deal with? Is that like, have you can you speak to that at all?
A little bit. So I
Sure.
think, part of the challenge is data isn't accessible for all communities, right?
Yeah.
If you have a community in Utah where there's 150 people, the ability to get data at a really granular level, you're not going to be able to get that. And so you're not going to see the before and after until I think next year will be the first year that'll be, either side of the COVID spike.
Yeah.
Um, but I think we've tried to be kind of quietly clear. So if we have graphics where the 2020 data is really weird, or in some cases isn't even available, we leave a gap. and we, note it. We don't necessarily spend a ton of time getting into that, but try to highlight it in kind of subtle ways. Which I think that's also one of the struggles is when you do have a lot of nuance in your data, trying to effectively communicate that in a easy to understand way. COVID has been a great example of
Yes.
that.
There's a
But
lot
then
of
also,
opportunity when it comes
yeah,
to
another
COVID related
opportunity, but it's
data. I'll just put it
also,
that way.
yeah, also, hopefully, knock on wood, like, isn't something that's going to be a recurring issue. So I think in a lot of data, you might have, you have like the Great Recession is something that you see do weird things in data, and you have that period in 20 and 21. But normally you'll have some kind of trend line you can rely on. And so that's another way to look at it is what did that line look like before the shock to the system? And what does it
Mhm.
look like after? And are they in the same place? Are they different? Like that's another way to navigate that.
That reminds me, actually, like data storytelling in general is so important because, like we say that, like census data, for instance, it's just two-dimensional until you actually flesh it out and make it as part of a story. It really doesn't carry much meaning. And when it comes to the COVID example, that's really so true. Unless you like put a story around it and kind of explain it in context, those numbers can be misleading because it's just
Hmm.
not. So for agencies that are trying to use their data to develop better public policy and relationship building too, because it's not just in order to craft effective public policy, there are a lot of people involved. So what advice do you have for agencies who are trying to get their hands around using data for those reasons?
So I might have a little bit of a bias because we are an applied research shop. So we're connected to the university, but we're not focused on, peer-reviewed materials. We want to have materials that we can give to people that have a minute or 30 seconds to look at our information, and we want them to be able to get something out of it. And so I would say, try to keep things simple. Like on my team, I'm always like, let's stay away from the baseball stat anything, when you're like, well, when considering that the sky was blue on July 27th, that meant that the temperature was 3 degrees cooler. But what do you want people to get out of that, right? And that can be really tricky, especially if you're in a space where you're used to doing really thorough research and being really meticulous in your record keeping. I'm not saying don't do that, but I think having a really easy to understand format that is simple and clear has been really productive for our team and working with our stakeholders in the state. Because the other thing is, everyone does, you're the expert on whatever the topic is. And so sharing that expertise in a really easy to understand way makes life a lot easier.
I was reading an article recently, and it showed it had a colored chart. It was very pretty, and it was trying to explain some data point or whatever. And I stared at it. I have no idea what it was doing. It had lines, and some of the lines were dotted, and I just stared at it, and I have no idea what the X and Y axis are supposed to be. And that is a really good example. It sounds like of what you are not supposed to do because it had a lot of great information. I don't think anybody can figure it out except the people who created it. Is funding ever an issue? I mean, I know like for agencies, funding, we always toss out government has funding issues, but when it comes to data, how much does that have an impact?
Um,
Or does it
I
necessarily
that's
have, or is it just sort of baked into general government operations as having, with say staffing or something like that, or um,
I think up to like this year it had been baked in. I think there are things right now that are I was on another webinar recently where a bunch of different people with different statistical organizations, research organizations were really concerned about some of the data that is an underlying input for a lot of other things. Um, is maybe getting looked at in part of, the changes going on. Um, and I think something that my old boss used to say is that like the demographic data that we work with in particular is kind of like air, like you don't realize that you need it until it's taken away. And
yeah.
so it's one of these kind of quiet infrastructure pieces that people might think you don't need to invest in, but it is really important because you have to spend time on the back end, getting things in, getting your inputs, cleaning it up, making it make sense, doing the checks. And then I think on the communication side of that, it gets tricky because I think the community in every space I have been in, the focus hasn't necessarily been on the communication side. It's like getting the numbers and getting the spreadsheet. But if you're not communicating it effectively, like it's just going to sit somewhere, right? And
Yeah.
how useful is that going to be? And so I think, I know that can vary place to place, and I see that even locally, like places that are putting a little more into trying to invest in both sides of that, how that is a different story than other parts of the area.
Yeah. No, that's a good point where you're saying it's like air because it reminds me lots of times, like I'm a writer, and lots of times when you're writing an article, you're looking for a statistic. You're like, well, it would be great if I found this fact to support my whatever. And so you do research and you're like, well, somebody has to have come up with this study. And sometimes not. Like, we've just made up in our heads what would be great to find a statistic on, and it doesn't necessarily exist. So yeah, I mean, so you really need statistics, you need numbers and stuff in a way that you don't necessarily always realize you need them until you do, which was not a very coherent sentence, but it made a lot of sense in my head. Um, so you have a lot of experience when it comes to data and data projects and collection and stuff. So could you talk a little bit about some of your experience and things that you've seen and some of the projects you've worked on and things like that?
Yeah, so our team largely works with data that's already been collected. So either through local state agencies collecting their data on, births or deaths or school enrollment or whatever the thing may be, and then using a lot of Census Bureau data. And we have skills on our team ranging from, descriptive statistics, and they're using Excel, to people that are coding in R and doing really intense modeling. And it's been really helpful for us to have that spectrum of understanding. The modeler loves doing those complicated charts where you're like, yeah, this is cool. What am I looking at? And it's, the log of something, whatever. I don't know what's happening in those. So then we try to translate his thing that he got excited about to something that the rest of us can understand. And so I think that kind of diversity of experience on our team has helped us communicate things better and also think about things differently. I think it's really helpful to have a bunch of different brains in the space, kind of adding their insights and questions. And I think that's one of the big things is, if our graduate assistant is confused, someone has to be able to explain it to them. And if they can't, we have an issue. And so we do a lot of kind of internal workshopping before we release anything. Our team releases a lot of kind of static products, so a lot of reports with a lot of visuals. And again, we try to keep those visuals really, really streamlined. We used to be a little more complicated in our approach, but then it's like, I also go out and present these findings to different groups throughout the community. And if I can't, show a slide and talk about it in 30 seconds, that figure didn't work. And so then, I'll
Yeah.
bring that input back. We do a lot of iterative things as well. So we'll do a release, once every couple of years for certain products. And so that's allowed us to kind of make those edits over time when things don't work, and we can make those tweaks and adjustments. But yeah, I think having different kinds of brains in the room is super useful. And I know in a lot of research spaces that doesn't always happen. And then that
Yeah.
silo gets super echoey, and you maybe don't realize the thing you're saying or doing isn't going to be the most useful or helpful.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was just thinking like the data and presenting it. It's like the data equivalent of plain language. We talk about making sure what your audience is and putting it in like what I refer to as human speak, but it sounds like, it's the same deal. It's the same thing. What kind of projects have you like worked on? Like what issues and stuff? Because you said you collect data, all different kinds of data, but what are some of the ones that you've had input into?
Um, so we do locally produced population estimates and population projections. So looking at the most recent year and then looking out into the future. And that's probably the one where we have the most control and ability to make changes, using already collected data, right, as our inputs, but then thinking about how to navigate it. And that's one benefit, I think, of local data efforts is that there's a little more agility in how you can handle issues than something big like the Census Bureau.
Yeah,
Obviously, we value all of the work that they do, but you know, if a community is really changing quickly, that might be harder to address in a model that's built for the whole nation rather than a model that's built
yeah,
for a weird population of 3.5 million. So, um, I think we take in a lot of external stakeholder feedback in those processes and we get reviews from them. We try to make sure things align with other resources that exist or other contextual insights people might have. Um, and then, yeah, I think, like interpreting the Census Bureau data, we do a lot of that and trying to share. We did a whole series on the 2020 census data releases, trying to synthesize that and make it just easier for Utahns to know what's going on here. And then looking into different demographic trends around fertility, around migration. And that brings in a lot of that federal data again, using, data from the CDC and other Census Bureau resources to just kind of synthesize the things that we can see in the data. But if you just send someone to the CDC or census website, it's not likely they're going to be able to get that same insight without you having provided that kind of wayfinding.
yeah. It occurs to me, we recently interviewed somebody from the largest, fastest growing, wait, am I gonna get this right? The the largest, fastest growing city in the country. So it's the largest city in the country that's
Mm-hmm.
growing the fastest. I don't know if that made sense. But anyway, it occurred to me they're adding like 20,000 people a year. And it occurred to me at the time, like Census Bureau, you can't keep up with that. Like you're not surveying enough people. Certainly the, 10-year census is not going to capture a city that's adding like 100,000 people every 5 years. That's a lot to try and, to be able to get in exact data. So I think you do have to, it already compiled data. So, it seems like that's something that you really do need to be able to put some color work on, and understand your community more instead of just what like federally is able to be collected. Um, if you had two takeaways to leave with our audience or more, what would you want them to know?
Um, I will throw out the Census Bureau does an annual population estimate series. So there are annual
Oh, there
updates.
are. Okay, I'm
And
sorry.
communities can challenge, which I get a lot of calls about that, but that's a whole nother webinar. Um, but I
Does that
guess
happen
one thing
often?
would be,
That's a whole
yeah,
nother
one of those
conversation, but does that happen often that they challenge
um,
it?
in Utah, yeah, there's a handful of communities that feel like their fast growing nature is not being captured. And there's a whole bunch of methodological reasons why that happens, but that's
Sure,
taken a
sure.
lot of the past year or two of my life. What I would try to give as takeaways is one, kind of getting an understanding of what is out there. Like you probably don't have to create the data point you're looking for. There's a lot of great federal resources, state resources. I'm a part of the State Data Center network, which is a partnership between the Census Bureau and all 50 states and the island areas. And so I know there's at least one person in every state who would love to help you navigate Census Bureau data. So there's things like that where there are existing resources or different organizations that might be able to help. Um, and then I think the second one would just be try to keep it as user friendly as possible, especially if you're doing kind of, working with your constituents. What do you really want them to get out of what you're sharing? And how can your language kind of be used most efficiently, I guess, to convey that without adding too many layers to confuse. Um, because I think as researchers, we're prone to provide way too much, and then people get lost. And so it's providing those steps of information, I think are really helpful. And then they have the opportunity to ask you additional questions, and you can be like, I did have that in my back pocket, but for 97% of your audience, they may not need, the 45-page working paper or something you've got behind it.
Yeah, as exciting as it is,
Yeah,
as much as they should read it.
exactly.
So the organization you were talking about, the State Data Center, I just butchered that. The State Data Center, is that right? So how
Yeah.
can people reach out and find out more about that?
So on census.gov, you could plug in their little search bar state data centers, and there's a contact list so you could find the entity that runs that in your state. And they're a mix of government organizations, university people like me. There's a good mix of librarians. I would also say librarians are so helpful. And they are so willing to explain everything to you. So you also probably have a network of federal data repository librarians, but they know at least the federal data like through and through. There are a lot of universities. So I would lean on those people that maybe have a little additional background if you are feeling lost. And then there's other resources out there too. There's like the ACS data user community. If you're starting to jump in and you really want to go in all the way, there's a great, back and forth there between different kinds of experts with navigating that data as well. So those are probably my top three kind of easy to access resources are the members of the State Data Center Network, those librarians, and then the FDLP. I'm getting that acronym wrong, but those federal data repository people really know their stuff.
I had a boss years ago who referred to acronyms as like alphabet soup. He was telling me
Mhm.
about some issue, and there's so many acronyms. He and I were getting confused, and he just referred to them as alphabet soup. So I've always thought about that. So when everybody says an acronym that's got like four or five like five letters or more, it's like it's intentionally meant to be like confused. But that's very interesting. I didn't know about the state data center group. So, but if anybody has any questions about that, then feel free to get in touch with us and we can just give you a little bit more information because that sounds like an awesome resource. And we actually do have a lot of librarians in the GovLoop community. So,
Good,
and
good.
they're fantastic. They're very, very helpful. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I just really wanted to thank you for being here because we talk about like data all the time. We talk about how to craft surveys. We talk, a lot of different, we have a session on plain language, which was cool. But we don't necessarily talk about how to use data that already exists and make it work for you and present it. So this is the first time we've really done that. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
No problem. So just a few more things, everybody. Our next networking chat, we're going to talk on April 14th on a Monday, and we're going to talk about how to make your organization more CX savvy. If you're interested in being a CX speaker, then just let us know. We'd love to hear from you. We do have a monthly newsletter, so check it out and see, there's lots of opportunities for ideas and blogs and such. We have a LinkedIn group, like I mentioned before, so absolutely feel free to join that and ask your friends to join. And that's your opportunity to share any of your ideas, perspectives, just anything CX that you'd like to offer. And if you have topics that you want us to talk about, or just general comments, then email Candace.Thorson at Yahoo. Oh my gosh, at govloop.com. Did I mention it's the end of the day on Monday? Um, well, thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Mallory. And thanks everybody for participating and being here. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.